You like the bell?
Yeah.
Oh.
Delightful come together.
All right, welcome back, everyone, for afternoon of our final session. So our closers are up now, so we're really happy to have David and Jesse Peterson talk about making what makes a good language. So take it away.
Yeah. All right. So, do you want to stand here, or should we stand apart?
Well, I was just trying not to block the light.
All right. Now I'm really blocking it. How about this? Okay. Anyway, hello everybody. Welcome back. Our goal is to keep you awake after a very lovely lunch. After that, anything goes. But we are David and Jesse, just a little background. Our background is in linguistics. I finished at my master's down at UC San Diego in 2005. Jesse finished with her PhD at Boulder in 2008. And this, of course, is where I did my undergraduate education. I came to linguistics late. I started as an English major. I also finished as one, but I added linguistics along the way for fun. Anyway, it was also here in LeConte Hall, in fact, which is down near the Campanile, in the fall of 2000, where I created my first language during my first linguistics class. This is known now as Conlang, which is short for constructed language. The in-universe, the in real life reason behind this word is because they needed a word at the front of the listserv that was used as the primary meeting place for language creators. It's still run out of Brown University. And they needed something at listserv.brown.edu, so they chose Conlang. And that just became the word for it. Anyway, but to start us off on something different, just thought we'd start here. All right, let me know when you recognize this song. I'm hoping at least some people recognize this song. This is That Thing You Do, the song from the movie That Thing You Do, starring Tom Hanks and a bunch of other people. Oh, including a guy that would later go on to speak one of my languages, him, in the show Star Fox. Anyway, so That Thing You Do is a fake song, but I want to focus on this word fake to really tease apart what it means. If you've never looked at the work of George Lakoff, who did most of his important work here at Berkeley, it's worth looking into. The book Metaphors You Live By, it's short, it's great, I recommend it. So I want to tease apart the meaning of fake and exactly what that means. So this right here is a fake horse, but this is not, which is confusing because neither of them are actually horses, right? So a real horse, right, looks like a horse, feels like a horse, you can sit on it like a horse, it's alive like a horse, right? A fake horse looks like a horse, and you can sit on it like a horse, presumably, but it doesn't actually probably feel like a real horse, and it's definitely not alive. So that is a fake horse. This describes, for example, anything that you'd see on a carousel, right? A motorcycle, you might sit on it like a horse, but it doesn't really look like a horse. And so it doesn't make sense to call a motorcycle a fake horse any more than it would say to call a chair a fake horse. Neither of them are actually horses, but one makes more sense as a fake horse. So regarding this song, does calling it a fake song actually make sense? Well, a real song is something that you can listen to. Did somebody write it? Yes. Is it played with instruments? It has musical structure and so on and so forth. Yes, and so for this fake song, it also has all of those things, right? In fact, where it's different, though, is right here. So in the real world, this song was written in 1996 by somebody named Adam Schlesinger. In the movie that the song is in, the song was written by The Wonders, spelled like that, in 1964. There was no such actual band called The Wonders, and they didn't write it in 1964. And so what this means, it's not actually a fake song. It's a real song with a fake history that is being ascribed to it for the purposes of a movie, which is a fictional portrayal of events. And so when we talk about constructed languages, they are essentially languages. What is the difference between them? There's two things. One, it's the circumstances of their creation, and two, it's what they're used for, right? And most of the languages that we create have fake histories ascribed to them. So for example, something like the Dothraki language. It is a language, and it is a real thing in the sense that any language is a real thing. You can't go and find a language. It's just kind of a shared pattern of behavior. And even then, no two are alike. All of us speak English. None of us speak English the same way. Isn't that unsettling? So English doesn't actually exist any more than Dothraki does. But what's different is, first of all, how English came to be versus how Dothraki came to be. And second is that Dothraki is associated with this fictional world where they've given it this fictional history that there are these people who spoke it and so on and so forth. Anyway, so getting that out of the way, let's talk about a history of language creation, very brief. It starts right here, as far as we know. This is the first recorded instance of anybody actually creating a language. This is Hildegard von Bingen, who created her language Lingua Ignota in the 12th century. It wasn't a language proper, it was just a massive amount of vocabulary, especially considering the time. And it was primarily nouns, just a pronunciation, and she used it with Latin grammar and also Latin verbs in song primarily. She believed she was inspired directly by God to create this language. And there are similar projects from around the same era that had similar inspiration. They were believed to be divinely inspired, and so they were being written down. Around the 18th century, is this 1700s? Or is it 17th century, which is the 1600s? I can't remember.
It should be 1600s.
1600s, 17th century. We have the emergence of the philosophical language, which was, they had started to recognize that human languages were imperfect, and that this was unsuitable for science, which is supposed to be perfect and pristine. And so John Wilkins created this language, which he called his philosophical language, and so it's just called John Wilkins' philosophical language, where he attempted to classify the entire world so that every time that you saw a word, you would know what it meant, because you simply followed the classification. Imagine like the ordering of animals, you know, phylus, genus, and so on. If you just put a single sound for each one, then that was basically how it worked. And it started with the primary elements, which were, it was like mineral, celestial.
It started even bigger than that, because it was like divided into two. It was,
Was it light
like
and dark?
terrestrial and celestial.
Something
and
like
then
that,
from
yeah.
that, yeah.
Yeah, so it was, you know, scientific for the time. There were other attempts like this. The problem was that they discovered at the end, after having done all this, that the languages were rather unwieldy. You can imagine if you were talking about breeds of dogs, and I just described to you how this language was created. Just imagine different types of breeds of dogs. All of these words that are exactly the same except for like the last letter, and they're very long.
And,
it was very tedious.
And then also they still followed whatever grammar of the language they spoke.
Oh, of course, yeah. And so the next big event in the history of language creation was the auxiliary language. This is L.L. Zamenhof, who created Esperanto. It wasn't the first one. The first one, as far as we know, was Volapük by Schleyer. But this was the most successful. And here their idea was, if everybody spoke the same language, then there would be no more war, which didn't pan out. I know, it was too bad. Things were going really, really well for Esperanto and also competing languages up until World War I. Kind of started to make a comeback, and then World War II really, really killed it. And that kind of was the end of the movement where, like, you know, people were suggesting it would be used in the League of Nations and things like that. That wasn't going to happen anymore. But Esperanto remains very, very successful in that there's still 1 million people who speak it. There are native speakers of Esperanto. I was actually taught Esperanto by 2 native speakers here at Berkeley in a decal class, which is where students can teach a class. Anyway, next we have the 20th century, where as far as we know, there were certainly instances of kind of like toy languages created for books. I'm thinking of Thomas More's Utopia and also Jonathan Swift. But Tolkien, as far as we know, was the first person to actually create languages for fun and write about it, where he said, I'm not actually creating this for a book, which was true. He just was doing it because he enjoyed it. In fact, he wrote the books so that his languages could have a place to breathe. And then, of course, the books became really popular, and his language creation productivity kind of wound down, which was too bad. But this was kind of a novel idea for a lot of people, creating a language for fun. And it inspired a whole lot of people, as did this. This is Mark Okrand, who created the Klingon language for Star Trek III, which was in 1984. He's also a graduate of Berkeley, had his PhD here, and worked in closed captioning. This is a picture I took of him when we were in Amarillo. This is a thing they do. They have all these Cadillacs just in the sand outside of Amarillo, and they spray paint it. It's like a thing. You go and spray paint it, and you take photos, graduation photos. Anyway, both, like, Tolkien was one thing, and then Klingon was another. It ended up really inspiring a lot of people to both learn the languages, but also to create their own. But even then, there wasn't a critical mass until the internet started to make its way into homes. That was when language creators found each other, because even with Tolkien, even with Klingon, you're talking about like 1 out of every 1,000 people that becomes really interested in creating their own language. And most of the people they talk to in their lives or encounter will have absolutely no interest in what they're doing at all. And won't understand it, and will usually ridicule them. That was, I've been changing that over the last 25 years. Anyway, so with the advent of the internet, though, language creators found each other online, kind of formed their own community so that they could learn from one another. And from that, an outgrowth of that was the first language creation conference that was here at Berkeley at the top of the ASUC building. You might recognize me up there in the top, and then right there is Sylvia Sotomayor, good friend of mine, whom you heard a little bit about yesterday. This is the first language creation conference here at Berkeley. So I was also a Berkeley grad who organized it. From this language creation conference, we had the second one here as well. The Language Creation Society was formed, and that kind of leads us to, where we get started.
And so we're going to just do a brief overview of our work, just so that way you know some of the places where you can see things that we have done, starting with David's work on Game of Thrones, and then that has continued into spin-offs like House of the Dragon. And so that was really the start of, well, our career. His career, I joined later. After Game of Thrones, David went on to work on all of these projects, among others. I think some of these are just here because they're my favorite of his, whether or not they are popular, like Emerald City. It should have gotten more than one season. Defiance was amazing.
Defiance was great.
Penny Dreadful was amazing. And so, yeah, a lot of these things people may or may not know as well. And then in 2019, I joined David to work on a show called Motherland Fort Salem, where we created the Méniche language for witches. From then, we started working together on all projects that came David's way. And that includes Shadow and Bone, where we created a lot of languages for that series, another short-lived series that should have gotten more airtime. Speaking of short-lived series, Paper Girls. Yeah. 1 season on Amazon Prime, blink and you miss our contribution, but we created the Quechua language for time travelers that show up in the series. They ended up taking the language out of the show, except for one brief moment of static in radio static, where you hear a tiny, tiny bit of the language that we translated like 20 pages of. We've also worked on The Witcher. Most of this is David. He did Hinlinga for The Witcher, but then I worked with him on Rojlinga, which is a spin-off for Sirens of the Deep, which was like an anime for The Witcher world. We did Vampire Academy, where we created the Ajnamari language, Pixar's Elemental, Legendary's Dune, and then more recently, Superman, where we created Su Ankrypton. In the meantime, we work together on our YouTube live stream, Langtime Studio, every Thursday, where we spend 2 hours creating languages live. So people just join in to watch us create languages. It's a very messy process. And we don't monitor, we don't edit. They get to see all of the blank faces and looks as we go along. And we only work on the languages in the 2-hour chunks. So like in between, our audience isn't missing anything.
Oh
which
my gosh. It's like we have severance selves.
it is. We show up and we do the 2 hours and then we clock out and we never go again. In our live streams, we're creating languages for anthropomorphic animals. And so these are some drawings I've done of some of our speakers. But just because they're animals doesn't mean that the language is any different than what we would do on our other projects. We're still creating very humanoid languages because they are anthropomorphic animals in our world that we are putting together of these sort of magically humanoid animals like the mice. And so the jalala is how I'm About to Sing comes out in Wokutiju, which is our language for the mice. And this is sort of an accidental thing of all of the grammatical endings coming together, that it ended up being alala in high tone at the end. And it just tickles me to no end that I'm About to Sing ends in alala. And so that is some of the work that we do. I feel like this was then going to you. We changed the order of when we were presenting what, but
Yeah,
I'm
I think
pretty
you're
sure
right.
this is you.
I think you're right. Incidentally, we do our live stream every Thursday at 2 p.m., which would be in 8 minutes. We're here.
Oh, we are missing it, yes.
Canceled. We canceled this week for all of you.
That language is not going anywhere until next week.
Yeah, so when it comes to an authentic language, we want to explain what we mean by that. So here's just 4 different constructed languages that are very, very, very different. So you might recognize Esperanto in the green square there. Below that, that's the language we created for Vampire Academy, Ajnamari. In the yellow, that is a signed version of a Creole experiment that I did here in 2001 in a class I was taking with John McWhorter, where you create a small number of words with no grammar and have people use them. This is just a signed version of that. And then above that is actually Trent Pearson's language, one of his languages. I actually have no idea what on earth this says, but this all says something. It's gorgeous and it's really impressive. And I would love to know how it works, but I don't. But it's just something to appreciate. Anyway, looking at Esperanto right now, I wanted to do a quick comparison. So we have something like English here. We have these 2 different but obviously related both semantically and even, you can tell, etymologically related words, right? We have sit, which is, just sit as you're doing, in the non-past form, which is sit, and then the past tense form, which is irregular, sat. And then we have this somewhat related verb seat, which is the transitive version of this. In other words, to seat somebody is what I mean there, not the noun form. And this is a regular verb. So in other words, you seat somebody, then you've seated them. And the regular part is just the ed on the end there. Very normal for English. If you translate all of these into Esperanto, what you will notice is that this is instead completely 100% regular. We have the same root here, seed, for all of them, this sit-related root. You have the same suffix for the present, for both of them, as, us. Same for the past, is. And then you also have this interesting little suffix which takes any intransitive verb and makes it transitive. They also have one that makes a transitive verb intransitive, and it looks like this, but it has a hat on it. It's pronounced differently. It's got a circumflex accent over the G. I thought that was a poor design choice, but anyway, but the whole thing is completely 100% regular, because that was part of the goal of Esperanto, to eliminate the irregularities of human languages. So the question is, if you're going about and creating a language for a set of human beings, like the Dothraki, for example, who are supposed to, they live in a magical world, but nevertheless, they're supposed to be human beings just like us. The question is, well, what exactly makes sense for them, right? And so it helps to kind of consider humans versus some things that aren't humans. For example, humans versus machines. This is a little sidebar, but I grew up playing games like this on the Apple IIgs. This happens to be King's Quest IV. My favorite was 3. But in King's Quest IV, you are Roselia, and you show up on the shore where there's all of these different, like, Aesop's fables and fairy tale things. And so you come here, and this is this little house, and you go inside, and it becomes very obvious, that's Roselia there, that you're in the Seven Dwarfs' house. and the seven dwarfs' house is messy. If they catch you in here, then that's the end of the game. You have to go back to your last save point, which takes like 10 minutes if you're on an Apple II GS just to reload. Anyway, so my friend and I are playing this. We are probably 10 years old, and we both know what's going on. All right, we need to clean this stupid house, all right? But there is a text interface for this, where you type something in, you give the computer commands, and then it executes those commands, hopefully. And so we started doing some things. Said, clean house. And it says, you can't do that right now. Like, tidy house, you can't do that right now. Tidy, you can't do that right now. You can go over here, this is a cupboard. You say, open the cupboard. There's a broom in there. And so you say, get broom. And it's like, what would you do with that? So it's like, clean house with broom. Why would you do that? And so then we started thinking, okay, what else could this be? Like clean table? Nope. Clean kitchen? Nope. Clean dining room? Nope. Like sweep? Nope. Sweep with broom? Nothing. And in the meantime, we're having to dodge the stupid dwarf coming back in. So we only have a limited window to try to get it right. At some point, we're taking turns typing things in. I'm at the keyboard. I'm about to type in clean house, because I'm like, have we done clean house yet? And so my friend Blaine, he says, oh, yeah, we already did that. I'm like, all right, whatever. So I type in the word clean, and then I just hit return to get a new line. She goes to the freaking cupboard, takes out the broom, and starts cleaning. All you had to do was type clean. If you typed anything else, nothing would happen. So there was some communication happening here, right? But the difference is that this machine obviously could not extrapolate based on any other context clues. You had to enter the exact right thing in order to get the thing to happen. Obviously, this is not, this is the lowest level type of AI that you can get. Humans, on the other hand, are just really, really, really good at doing this. We have a nice example here.
And so to look at how humans can take context and figure out what meaning is actually intended without all of that there, we're looking at a scenario where David does what he normally does when he walks into a house of a person he knows. He opens the fridge. Is this not true?
This is true.
This is true.
This is true.
And so if you imagine David does his thing and he says, anything to drink, my answer might be top shelf right. And so let's look at this, and I think everybody probably immediately has a full picture of what's being asked, what's being done, what's being intended by the reply. But if we look at the question, anything to drink, first and foremost, that is shortened. It's not even a full sentence. It's really short for, do you have anything to drink? David's rooting around in the fridge. This is what he's asking. And really, really what he's asking is, do you have anything that I can drink, right? So it's not just do you have anything to drink? My answer could have been yes, but don't. But that is not the intended question here. So in saying anything to drink, David is assuming that something will be in the refrigerator to drink, and that I will know that David has opened the refrigerator door and is looking inside of it at that moment. And again, knowing David, I know that's regular behavior. The answer, top shelf right, is again shortened. For something to drink is on the top shelf of the refrigerator on the right-hand side. And because I'm answering in this way, what I'm implicitly saying is that, yes, you can have what is on the top shelf on the right-hand side. There may be more to drink in the fridge, but what I'm narrowing down is what you can drink is on the top shelf on the right-hand side. And this is all communicated in very shorthand ways where you have to have context, you have to have situational context to go with that linguistic communication. And so the character of my response tacitly acknowledges that, hey, it's okay that you opened my refrigerator door, and now that we're married, it really is okay. You can look inside it, and we don't need to have further communication about this. And we humans are incredibly great at this stuff. The amount of connections we can make from very little input, including if you think about how much knowledge you have to have of a situation and context to use a pronoun, it's insane. We are really, really great at this. When we're looking at languages and thinking about linguistic phenomena of what happens, there's like this giant world of phenomena. Here, the yellow circle represents phenomena that is attested in natural languages. In other words, linguists have gone out, they've documented, they've found these patterns in language, and that's our knowledge so far of what exists. That doesn't mean that it's everything that's possible, and so this orange circle represents, more possibilities. And in fact, it also represents what could already happen in languages. We just haven't documented it yet because there are a lot of languages that are still being documented. Then there is, in this wider world, phenomena that are possible in a system, but not in a human language. And so when we work, what we're aiming for is this realm. We're looking for patterns that people will feel comfortable recognizing and understanding this is a language, this is a linguistic system. But we're also expanding to say we don't have to use things that have been attested. If there are other features that make sense for the system we're building, we can go out of the box, so to speak. And so looking at what makes a good language, if you're thinking about human-type languages, let's look at a metaphor of this image here is the crown jewels of England. It was King Edward, his crown. Still in use for coronations today, some 400 years later. And so this is a crown. However, this is also a crown, which was made for the movie Braveheart. And fun fact, it is right now up for bidding. And so if you want to own the crown from Braveheart, be ready to spend about £2,000 or £3,000, but you can own it, and it comes with the doublet. So you get the chain doublet and the crown from the movie. It's a piece of movie history. And this is also a crown. This crown came from medieval times. I've never actually been, by the way. But
Medieval times, dinner and tournament.
But also a crown. And so we see these three crowns. And if you ask the question, which is a good crown, you may have an answer in your head. But let's stop and back up a minute. This is a good crown for England. It's a good crown for ceremonial purposes, for historical purposes, for England. Not a great crown for movie situation. Because if you were to produce one of these crowns, first of all, it's horribly expensive to actually produce that crown. And if it's just one prop among many within a movie, not a great idea. Furthermore, this thing weighs like 5 pounds, and people shoot on movie sets all day long. You don't want someone wearing this 5-pound, really expensive crown on their head for 8 hours at a time, because then you're going to be sued for neck problems. So not great for movies. Really not great for mass production if you're trying to do something like medieval times and hand one out to everybody who comes through the door. So good crown in one scenario. The crown from Braveheart, not great for England's purposes. This is effectively a piece of metal that has been shaped into a crown. Great for the movie because it looks good in the context where it's being used, but still not great for mass production. Very expensive, pointy edges. You don't want to hand these out for anyone walking through the door of something like medieval times. Whereas this crown, being a paper crown, really not great for coronation ceremonies, I wouldn't think.
God, that'd be hilarious.
I mean, you gotta, I guess, ask the next king or queen who gets crowned if that's what they really want. Not great if you're trying to make it look real in a movie, but wonderful for giant events where you want everybody to feel special with the crown. So in other words, they're actually all good crowns, but they're also all bad crowns. So it really depends on what you're looking for to figure out. You have to know their purpose, their intent, who's using them, and why to be able to answer the question.
Oops.
Oh, I think we both clicked it at the same time.
Sure did. Anyway, so back to what makes a language good. There are a lot of assumptions about language that are based on what or how to answer that question. There are a lot of assumptions based on what a language is, what it can be, and what it should be. And most assumptions about what language can be are based on essentially human language as a baseline and frankly, usually one's native language. So it's like if you give somebody just a random line from a created language, this is from Valerian, and you say that this means Daenerys saw me. Most monolingual English speakers will say, all right, well, there's Daenerys, there's saw, and there's me. But that's not right. The word order here is subject, object, verb, so the verb comes at the end. It's actually Daenerys me saw. And so sometimes we get questions like, well, if you're creating a language, why do that? Why not make it simple? Shouldn't it be easy if you're creating a language? And so, but this, of course, raises other questions like, is this simple, the English here? I mean, first of all, this is redundant. I think we all have to recognize this because this pronoun right here indicates case. In other words, it indicates that it's not the subject of the sentence. The word order also does that. That would be simpler. Just Daenerys saw I. And in fact, what is the deal with this irregular verb? That would be simpler. I guess if you were concerned about the similarity in spelling to the noun, then you could just throw another ed on the end there, or maybe 3 e's.
I think 3 e's is the way to fix it.
Yeah, 3 ec. Yeah. Got it. Anyway, but also it's not necessarily as clear. Let's say you're sticking with me. This is better, I think, because this takes care of all the word orders. So you just say all of them. Because after all, this implies case. So it is obvious just with the words as they are, which one is the subject and which one is the object. So, I mean, wouldn't you want to take care of everybody and make sure that it's very, very clear? And in fact, if you really, really, really wanted to be redundant, this is probably the best right here. Just in case, people forget as you go along, you just keep going, right? And you just keep repeating to make sure that it becomes quite clear. But there's a reason that we not only don't do this in English, we don't do this in any human language. There's this, we're going to capital E notion of efficiency, that if you were to try to encapsulate this in a single sentence, you might say something like, make your contribution such as is required at the stage at which it occurs by the accepted purpose or direction of the talk exchange in which you are engaged. This is a nice way to encapsulate a governing principle behind human language that was created by H.P. Grice. This was essentially his theory behind what he called the cooperative principle, which is that essentially when human beings speak, they are attempting to cooperate. And he came up with these 4 maxims that kind of describe the cooperative principle. And incidentally, people have done a lot of work since then. Like it went down to Q and R principles, and then it was just Q, and then it was just quality. I think that was the last one. I don't know. There's been a ton of iterations. But the idea is maximum of quantity. If I can say, if somebody says, what are you doing? And I'm eating lunch, then it makes sense to say I'm eating lunch. You don't need to say, I am sitting in a chair in a room that is slightly warm, and before me I have a plate. On this plate I have put food that I enjoy, that was provided for me at a buffet. And presently I am using a fork to take some of this food and put it into my mouth, where I am chewing it and swallowing it on occasion, interspersing every so often with a drink of water. I prefer water. There are other beverages supplied, but this is the one that I prefer. So you can say that, and it's all true, right? But it's just pointless, right? So this is what the idea of the maximum of quantity talks about. Basically, say exactly as much as you should. And the idea, I'm giving you an example of just one of these. I'm not going to go over all of them. But the idea is that these are maxims that can be flouted and are flouted routinely by individuals on purpose. But you have to assume that they hold in order for the flouting to make any sense. The classic example is usually the professor that is providing a recommendation for their student. They're applying to graduate school, and they send off the recommendation which says, this student has excellent penmanship and always arrived promptly to class. And that's the extent of their recommendation to grad school, right? So the idea is you expect a lot more. Because they have provided less, it means something, right? And we figure out what that means. So that was Grice's idea. There are these overarching rules that govern conversations that can, and crucially must be flouted at times in order to imply things that you do not wish to say. Anyways, and this is basically the idea behind here is held for all human languages. And so that is essentially what is happening here, right? The whole, anything to drink, top shelf, right? There's all this stuff that is implied if this is the exchange about the relationship between the two speakers, what's happening, where they're from, like all of that is just kind of built in there. And so the cooperative principle attempts to explain why human languages are the way they are and why human conversations go the way they go, right? And so when we come back to this question, reminding us again of the crowns, and you go back and say, okay, well, what makes sense? You're creating a language for human beings that, all else aside, are supposed to be regular human beings, right? Well, then what makes sense for them if you're creating a language? What is a good language?
And so looking at the types of language that you can create, comparing something like Esperanto, which is incredibly regular, or English, which has irregularities built in because of historical changes, historical journeys and etymologies of words, borrowings, etc. And this system, which has none of that baked into it, when you're trying to create a naturalistic language for human speakers, Esperanto is not the way to go because human languages don't work that way. There are always some irregularities, as you may have noticed by studying other languages. Anytime you study a new language, they present generally to beginning students as many regular patterns as they can, and then you find out that none of those patterns actually help you when you want to be a more advanced speaker because there are other words that are much more irregular, much more frequent that are used by speakers that you just have to know. And then you find out that really speakers of that language never say that expression at all. That's only textbook French. You're never going to actually use it in France. And so that kind of a system is what you're aiming for in a naturalistic humanoid or human language.
Oh my God, I'm going to forget if I don't say it right now. Apparently in Finnish, tosi is more colloquial, more common. Todella is just like, is considered bookish. It's proper. So now we know. Anyway, sorry.
Well, we also know not to actually say Svenga kuin hirvi, which means like something grooves.
It grooves like a moose.
They teach you that idiom as a beginning student of Finnish, but they don't actually use it in Finland. And if you do use it, it's like, oh yeah, I think my grandma would say that. So this is a chart from Su Hankrypton, from the language that we created for Superman. I almost lost my word for the movie. This is just two of the cases, nominative singular and ablative singular, that we have set up for the grammar of the language. So just two things that nouns can do. We're looking at three different nouns here. The noun for group, dov, ni, zoj, and horn, zov. Those are in the nominative or the subject role. And when they're in the ablative, which is a way of saying, usually it indicates direction away or out of a noun, andov over here, andoj, and angzov. You can start seeing as you compare that there are some changes that have been made. All of them have a sort of in-ish prefix going on in the ablative. But you may notice that, for instance, while dov just goes to andov, zoj goes to andoj. So we have a consonant change there. And then here with this one, it stays z, but suddenly the an becomes ang, zov. And you may be saying, what in the world is happening? Well, all of these come from the baked-in history that we created for the language. And so all of these words have protoforms or older forms historically that we then put sound changes to and apply different patterns as we put words and pieces together. And so dov was just an old word that always looked like dov, but ni in its protoform looked like doj with a palatalized d at the end. And then zov, horn, looked like that in its beginning stage. The prefix for the ablative was actually am, which you don't see an M anywhere in our current data set because of some sound changes that happened. And so you can see here that these consonants remain the same as the came together. But then the M assimilated to match where these sounds were made. So the, both very front of the mouth, so the N stayed there. This also front of the mouth, so the M became an N there. So there was one round of sound changes. Then, here we go.
Oh, yeah.
In between an N And a sound like Z, it also happened when an S followed it, and there was a stop inserted. So uns became uns. And you can kind of feel that, you kind of naturally do that whenever you have like a nasal followed by what's called a fricative. You often insert a sound in between just out of production. And so we made that a very regular epenthesis, as it were. Then,
I think I did this one at the same time. I can't remember, but essentially, the weak fricative became a stop after a nasal, so it was fortified. Sorry. Okay, then now it's the other one.
And from there, I was going to say I couldn't see the change, but I just glanced. From there, then the A-N-G segment here, there was another round of assimilation where a lot of different alveolar sounds actually changed in placement. So ung, which is actually very hard to say, became ung. So suddenly amzov became ungzov over time. And then finally, we had that change where the j became j, and so that changed sounds. And so this is, again, all changes because of a history that we created for the language and applied in very regular ways in the same way that human languages undergo sound changes during their evolutionary tails, so to say. So again, this is where we're aiming, a tested natural language data, what's possible in a human language. This is where we're aiming, and that system is within that goal zone.
Yeah. But yeah, you'll notice that there's a lot of space out here. And so when we start to think about, what might, I don't know, like how might things be different with entirely different species, entirely different modalities, there are certain things that I like to come to, certain things that I like to be reminded of. So this is just one of the, this is a meeting of the National Association of the Deaf in Colorado Springs in 1910. They would have meetings every 1 to 3 years because it was actually hard to let everybody know that it was happening and where it was happening, so they would be somewhat irregular. But one of the things that I learned about these early meetings is there are a number of things that they would do in addition to catching up. But there were these kind of, the equivalent to songs that would happen. And it was really interesting because essentially for this one in particular, the way it would happen is that they would start off with one leader who would basically sign things in a rhythm. So for example, something like boat, 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 drink, 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 enjoy, 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 enjoy. And then like everybody would follow along and they would kind of like build out a little story as they went along. And it's interesting because it's like obviously, they're deaf, so music is not something that has the same cultural significance that it does for us. But you still see rhythm. Rhythm is still something that's interesting, right? At the same time, something that was precisely like that is probably not something that you would really see in the hearing world outside of like a sporting event, because we have the ability to do so much more with sound, and so we do, right? But here it's more about kind of like the rhythm, and it's just kind of, it makes sense within the context of ASL. Oh, connection lost, damn me. Hold on, gotta hit this thing again. But anyway, another one, this was one, and I have no idea if anybody here works on Corvids, but this got passed around Tumblr for a while. This was so much fun. But apparently one of these behaviors for these groups of birds is what they call co-lying. They just kind of lie together. They're magpies. And you can see they're holding little claws there. This is something that is interesting to me because it's like if you start to strip away layers of communication and ask, well, what's left? Like what types of things that you do? Like what might this be for? And it might be the type of thing where it's like, if you do what I do, then you're cooperating with me, which is a good thing. And that could be it. And that could be something that's inherently valuable, right? Just a way to demonstrate, you're a friend and you're with it. This actually, when I saw this yesterday, this reminded me of this. We had this, so you have the bats, right? And what interested me about what Jussi was saying is that the bats aren't communicating, back here saying, food is here, right? Instead, it's just like these ones are actually just kind of following along, right? And so maybe it's just like that's just part of it. You know, what you're seeing is just it's valuable. There is inherent value in essentially either following or doing the same thing that other people do for good reason. And maybe that in itself is a type of communication. Anyway, so as you start to look away, I've always found it interesting when people want to look at animal communication and immediately want to see, is there anything that looks like the syntax of humans, which for some reason immediately when they say that, they also mean, is there anything that looks like the minimalist program, which is a weird thing, but anyway. And I was like, maybe language is a broader category than the assumptions that underlie human language specifically, because there are a lot of assumptions about things, about the way that language works or must work based specifically on the way that our languages work and also on our unique physiology. Anyway, so yeah, maybe, I don't know, successful communication for a non-human species and what counts as a good language will be different from what we've come to expect from human language. So anyway, just some food for thought and perhaps a little change of pace for the, for the couple of days we've been here. This is just thank you in a bunch of our languages. And if you want to find more stuff we do, you can do so here. All right, that's it. I'll hold on to this if we need to control it. All right.
Excellent. Thank you. Here, we'll start.
So in sign language,
Yes.
oftentimes what you'll do is establish stuff in space,
Yeah.
and then do things to connect those things in space to show relationships.
Yeah, so it's like, my father, and then like you kind of like point to this space, and then from that point on, this is kind of like the pronoun area for your father for the rest of the discourse, yeah.
Right. Sort of like a pronoun in Afro, but you also then would say, if I'm saying my father here and my mother here, and his or her father is there, and he drives and picks up the first one and picks up the second one, right?
Yeah.
Is there anything like that in spoken language?
So there are, I think the best way I can put it is this. This is, I find, an even better example from ASL specifically, right? So you have this word for a week that looks like this, and month that looks like this. But anytime you're doing anything in a sign language, your hand needs to be in some shape. And so because of that, they've taken advantage of this. So this is 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks. Same thing with months, 1 month, 2 months, 3 months. And not only that, since there's this general idea that, or this general spatial notion that the past is behind you, the future is that way, you can say 2 weeks from now, 4 weeks ago, 3 months ago, 4 months from now. And if you were to take this, if you were to try to make an analog of this in spoken language, right, what you would have to say is that this is going to be 2 words, right, week and month, that are being inflected with like affixes. And there's absolutely nothing like that in spoken language, nothing that broad. But if you think about it, it simply makes sense from the medium that this thing would exist in ASL, right?
Well, this is one of the things that happens.
Yeah.
Like when you teach young children sign, like their parents are not fluent, and you're just teaching vocabulary, the children will actually make this stuff up in order to actually be efficient.
Oh, wow.
And so, you see this repeatedly, even Nicaraguan sign,
Yeah.
right, which started out as just being, nouns and verbs, and it's gotten more and more of what we call classifiers. That actually make it as efficient as spoken language using tricks like you said. And it turns out whenever you try to do something like signed exact English, it's so hard for children to handle it that we've given up on it. And we've gone back with strict American Sign Language because of those efficiencies. Keeping up the same pace. It seems to be something about human language that requires a certain pacing. I don't know if you've seen that, but it feels true to me.
Yeah, also with signed exact English, you can imagine. There are 2 different signs for a and an, and so you have to figure out if the sign that you're signing happens to start with a vowel in English in order to use a or an properly, which is quite difficult for somebody who can't hear. But anyway, yes, essentially. And it's like, here's the part where you can actually play with it, because of course, what we're trying to do is we're trying to match that. In other words, if we're creating languages for real human beings, we're trying to make it look like this language is as indistinguishable from a natural language as possible. But of course, you don't have to do that. You can make a language that is human usable, maybe not in real time, but you can make a language incredibly inefficient, or like maximally efficient, incredibly complex. I mean, you can invent things that's like, this is a pronoun that is associated with the 7th noun that I've said since I began speaking. You can do that, and like you could figure out how to use it the same way that we can figure out how to put together jigsaw puzzles. But it's nothing that you would ever expect to occur naturally in a spoken language or a sign language, right? Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, and I will say that in general, innovation and efficiency are huge drivers of language change for spoken or signed languages. And yeah, efficiency is huge because it's got to be not only efficient that you can package a lot of information in small amounts, but in a way that makes sense for the people around you in the best way possible. And so a lot of language change that people look at and say, oh, these young kids are ruining our language, it's really more efficient. And like just yesterday, I saw Amazon Prime as a verb where you can't Amazon Prime skills, you have to take your time with them. And it's like, I understood exactly what they were saying. They took a lot of very big contextual information and packaged it in a way that's so efficient that it's like, I get it. I get exactly what you mean because of that.
One of the things we're also seeing now in sign language is because of FaceTime, sign language is becoming one-handed.
Yeah.
Seeing the language actually changing in front of us.
Oh,
Which is so cool, yes.
And the idea is that, with Amazon Prime is that you could just order it and have it shipped to you perhaps same day. That was the intended meaning there.
Thank you so much for the great talk. This is also even true within spoken languages, like Uriel Cohen-Priwa has showed that languages where you have like more information content per syllable tend to have fewer syllables per minute, and then languages with simpler syllables just have more syllables. But so it's like that's why Japanese or Spanish sounds like it's spoken faster, but the actual amount of information that is communicated in these languages like is the same. Do you guys also try to do something like that in conlangs, where it's like we're trying to make this as efficient as like a human language is, or like you're doing it for some humanoid species that is supposedly purportedly more intelligent, so they like are able to just speak Ethquil fluently? Is that something that you take into consideration?
Yeah, so when we're trying to create naturalistic languages, I have to say, I think we just essentially get it for free. And I would say, especially when I start recording stuff, like, recording on MP3 for the actors, it just makes sense in certain instances to either speed up or slow down. And then also, if certain information becomes redundant, and like you notice this in translation, it becomes easier to just drop it off, to replace it with something else, to include it less frequently. And I think that's something that's just very, very human.
And I can't say too much because Project NDA, but there is a language that we more recently created where no human ears will be able to actually learn it fully. Because there's something to it that you have to have different ear structure to hear the components to tell the difference between these two units that to humans will sound exactly the same. And so we have done it where it's like, there's a lot of information there, but you're not going to hear it.
Yeah. So on the question of redundancy, sorry, over here.
Oh, there. I was like, the microphone makes it sound like you're everywhere.
Yeah, really amazing talk. I'm particularly thinking about the example of, the Daenerys saw me in the least efficient version of that. And obviously in the animal world, we do have actually a lot of repetition. Some people like me also in the human languages are a little bit more verbose than others and have an issue with brevity. So I'm curious about when you're creating these languages, how much variability you allow for speakers within a language for that verbosity, or if y'all try to maintain a certain level of consistency within the language that all speakers would potentially use versus allowing for rambling or, repeated phrasing or, trying to emphasize through repetition or anything like that, or there might be variations that would then make it harder for, people to translate without knowing that context.
Part of that is going to be on the writer, because a lot of it we're translating. I will tell you in general, I've noticed over my years that for whatever reason, I think writers put less effort into dialogue that they know is going to be translated. It's just not as interesting most of the time. That was actually, and I noticed this because I noticed when the opposite happens. Like the first season of House of the Dragon, where I was translating all this stuff, I'm like, holy shit, this stuff is actually good. I guess I better bring my A game. So that's part of it, but the other part of it is also just your role as kind of your artistic license as the translator, getting a feel for the character and deciding, modulo the grammar, what makes sense for this character. There are certain things where it's like, in order for it to happen, it would actually require, the sign off of the actor and the showrunner and the writer and all so on. Like, if you're like, I really think this character should like have a stutter in this language, but stuttering works differently. It'd be like a whole thing. But it's like within our kind of like purview as translators. That is the type of thing we can do. If we're translating for more than one character.
Yeah, but the problem is
that
in
happens
some
a lot.
projects, only one character speaks the language. So we've got a whole system, and you only get one speaker. And that one speaker is very angry because it's in the middle of a war scene, and so all you hear
Always
is run,
shouting.
shoot, go. And it's like, that's all you're getting of the language because that's what was given to us. And so it can be difficult. We have worked on projects where we have been able to sort of establish different dialects and variation within it, including just like absolutely different sounds. Like if you compare the two, it'd be like, oh yeah, no, that's a very different use of the same language system. And so we rather enjoy it when we get to do that, but it takes a very big in-depth project before you get to those intricacies.
Yeah, quick question. You mentioned the rapid evolution that languages undergo, and I'm by far not an expert on ASL, but somebody told me recently that because of FaceTime, ASL is changing rapidly simply because people they hold the phone in one hand and they sign in the other. Do you know
Yeah.
much about that?
Yes.
So, yeah. That's what I was just saying.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's exactly.
What happens is, a lot of times if I'm doing like sign language, right, this is understandable. But if I'm doing table, for example, this is harder to understand, so I'll fingerspell it instead, just to be precise. So yeah, we're seeing people actively changing it. And British Sign Language is pretty horrible because you have to have two hands just to spell.
Yeah.
And now you start using your cell phone as the other hand.
It's a very different visual perception of the letter shapes.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we have lots of questions, but I don't want to take away your break because we want to keep you energized for the final stretch coming up in 25 minutes. But really
Feel free to
appreciate
chat during
you
the
could
break.
chat through it. Thank you so much. Really gives us a lot to think about in such a creative angle as we think about decoding communication in non-human species, to just think about this from all possible angles. So we're really thankful for sharing with us. We'll take in about 25 minutes, and then we have the final two talks coming up. So we have a talk about machine translation of human languages in the age of LLMs. Is this the end of the language barrier? By Marcus Freitberg and Hadar Shemtov from Google. And then we'll have an overview of marine bioacoustics and the perch model from Tom Denton and Laura Hara from Google. So see you back here in 25 minutes. Thank you.